when you take an oath of office, you take an oath to uphold the Constitution and the rules and laws that govern our democracy, and that transcends whatever party you belong to, who you would prefer winning or losing. I didn't enjoy having to call Donald Trump and congratulate him for having won the night of his election 4 years ago, but I did it because that's part of my job.
That was former President Barack Obama last night right here on MSNBC, striking a completely different tone from that of his successor, Donald Trump. The former president doing what leaders of this democracy have done for more than 200 years, while the current president ignores those traditions and norms and instead uses everything in his arsenal to try to convince the country, or at least his base, that he is not the loser. President Obama spoke about Trump and much, much more with our colleague, MSNBC contributor Jonathan Capehart. Jonathan joins us now. He's also an opinion writer for The Washington Post. Also joining us, our friend, the Rev Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and the president of the National Action Network. Jonathan Capehart, congratulations, my friend. This was a huge, huge scoop. You were the person he wanted to do this with, and it was a remarkable, remarkable interview. I was struck by, I watched that clip and I've seen it a couple times now. This is President Obama saying, we do hard things. Democracy is hard, but you have to want it. And I wonder if you got the sense from him that he thinks that Trump has done some irreparable damage to the country in the last 2 weeks.
I don't think that President Obama thinks that Trump has done irreparable damage. He does believe that he has done damage, but not irreparable. And that gets to the whole point of his book, that he has hope for this country, and that hope rests with the next generation, with young people. But he does think that damage is being done. And as he said in the interview, he's not surprised really by what Donald Trump has done or is doing. What surprises him is that there are Republicans who are letting him get away with it, who are just letting him do what he does and letting it happen, go unremarked. And he also said that he believes that they're doing that because they are intimidated by the president. And we've seen it for 4 years. The president has used the bully pulpit of the presidency, the bully pulpit of his Twitter feed, campaign rallies, you name it, to go after opponents, to go after adversaries, not just Democrats and fellow Republicans, but also private citizens. So I think he was remarking overall about that.
You know, that is going to be the legacy of this time, Rev. And if you look at all the examples of people he goes after, I mean, he has used his Justice Department to try to sue John Bolton for writing a book. Charlie Savage in the New York Times reported that he tried to go after Omarosa for writing a book. He's attacked me. He's attacked probably all three of us on Twitter. And people are still standing. I mean, what explains the cowardice of the Republican man, Rev, that they are the only people who think they can't survive a mean tweet?
Well, you can't bring cowardice out of people that are not cowardly. And what we began to see is that a lot of these Republican leaders must have been cowards all along, and all they needed was a bully to come out to expose it, and that's what Donald Trump has done. What I really think that a lot of us are missing is that even in these last antics for the last couple of days, and today where he's meeting with Michigan state officials, he's not declaring war against Biden. He's declaring war against all of us. He is undermining the very basis of having voting count. We spent all year trying to get record numbers of people to vote, to come out and vote. Those of us in the civil rights community telling people, vote about what we felt was our pain with George Floyd. Vote about Breonna Taylor. And people came out in record numbers, and he's sitting in the White House and telling people those votes don't matter. We can get state legislators to change that. And I really think we've got to see the existential threat this is to democracy itself. As long as we have it Joe Biden against Donald Trump, it becomes one argument. It's much deeper than that. And I think that's what President Obama was addressing, that the Republican leadership ought to be ashamed of themselves to be silent when this is going beyond the politics of November into really the very fabric of whether we're going to stand up as a democracy in this country.
No, I agree. I mean, that's what I hear, too. It is remarkable, though, Jonathan Capehart, just how low the bar is. Everyone assumes that Donald Trump is a toddler having a tantrum, but it really does make more noteworthy his enablers. I thought that what President Obama said about Vice President-elect Harris was really interesting. I want to play it and ask both of you about it on the other side. Let's watch.
I think that one thing we've learned over the last several years is that the challenges that women face as women are profound, just as race is a profound issue in our society, and women of color, have to deal with both. The good news is that Kamala's accustomed to it. She's been a first before. Right. She's been on the national stage. And my advice to her is actually really similar to my advice to Joe, which is surround yourself with great people.
They have it's just a neat dynamic and rapport between them. And as much as everyone sort of knows about the rapport and the warmth between the former president and his former Vice President Biden, it's cool to hear him talk about Vice President-elect Harris. What did you think about that, Jonathan Capehart?
Well, I asked him that question because, I've known that they have known each other for a long time, from when she was the DA in San Francisco. So they have a friendship that spans years. And, as he mentioned, she's a first. She was the first black person to be DA in San Francisco, the first black person, and probably also the first woman to be the Attorney General of California. So she's broken through some barriers, similar barriers that President Obama had to break through. And, the president recognizing the fact that, she's got the double barrier of being a woman and a person of color, and what comes with that when you are a public official and you're on the public stage.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.